All right, good morning. Hard to believe it's Thanksgiving time. Hard to believe. Somebody yesterday said 2017, and I thought a month and a half we'll have to say 2019. So if you have your Bible, Psalm 23. So I hope you all had a good week. I know for me it was pretty busy, but I'm thankful for Sunday, thankful for a day in which we can come and just remind ourselves of the goodness of God. Looking at this week, looking at Thanksgiving and just the opportunity we have to reflect a little bit on the year, on all that God's done. And I know that Thanksgiving can be a really happy time for many of us. For some of us, it can be a bittersweet time. And I thought it was fitting that today we're going to be on verse 3 of Psalm 23, talking about restoration. And Thanksgiving, for many of us, will be a day of family time. For some of us, that will be really, really nice. For some of us, that might be a little difficult. I know almost every week we have some who pray for family that are away from the Lord. I know that just thinking of, my family, whether it's extended family or even some that are closer that are just not living for God. We think we just want them to come back to living where they ought to be. And we think today of the theme restoration. What is it like for a lost sheep to be restored, to be brought back into the fold? Psalm 23 in verse number 1. The Word of God says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for His name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For Thou art with me, Thy rod and Thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." We talked about the first verse a few weeks ago, talking about God being our good shepherd and the comparison with God being a shepherd who truly cares about us and us being sheep. We talked about that phrase, "I shall not want." How God provides for every single one of our needs and we have no need to worry or be anxious. In the second verse, "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." About how God, in the second part, "He leadeth me beside the still waters." About how God cares for us spiritually, emotionally, by providing for us rest. Today we'll focus on verse 3. "He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for His name's sake." We think of Psalms, we think of David. Oh, how often he had to have his soul restored. Think of the times of discouragement when David cried out in the Psalms, "Why art thou cast down, O my soul?" When he was on the run from Saul, surely in caves, away from his family, away from those that he loved. The times of discouragement, the times of maybe depression, of worry. Think of the day in which Nathan the prophet came to David after he had lived in the sin of committing adultery with Bathsheba and murdering Uriah. Nathan pointed his finger in David's face and said, "Thou art the man." From that we have Psalm 51. When David got right with the Lord and he had to be restored. We think of restoration. Usually we think of somebody maybe restoring some furniture or an old car. Maybe you've seen somebody restore an old vehicle. They have something that's a rust bucket. It's full of rust everywhere. It's broken down. Maybe it doesn't have an engine in it. The inside's nasty. There's tears. There's rips. Some of you think I'm describing my truck that I brought last year. But it's just old. It looks bad. It doesn't run very well. It's broken down. Parts of it are just not working like they used to do, like they used to work. And what somebody do when they restore it? They take it open. They take things apart. They clean it. They repair things that are broken. They sew maybe parts of the interior. They vacuum. They maybe shampoo the carpets. Maybe they replace something that's full of rust. They pull out some dents. Why? To try and make it like it had been before. To restore it. Restoration speaks of taking something from a dilapidated and old, a bad state and returning it like new. Maybe you think of refurbished. Maybe you've bought something refurbished, like an old phone or an old computer. It was old and the inside of it was broken. It wasn't working, and they made it to be just like new. That's the idea of restoration. How many times when we have failed God and we feel so far from Him in sin, does He have to take us and forgive us and cleanse us and make us like new? Maybe you're thinking of a family member, a loved one. I know I'm thinking of one right now, who's away from God. Maybe they haven't lived for the Lord in a long time. Maybe it's only recent. And you can see in their lives the problems. You can see the bad decisions. You can see how it is breaking them down spiritually. And for you, it's a cause of worry. It's a heartache. And maybe you're going to see them this week, and you think God needs to restore them. Oh, if God would take their life and make it like new. We see in this psalm that God is the good shepherd, desires to restore the sheep. It's His desire to bring them back into a close relationship with Him. It's His desire for David when he was discouraged, when he was worried, when he was depressed, when he was at a low point in his life, to raise him up. And it was His desire when David was away in sin to bring him back to Himself. We know the illustration of sheep. Prone to wander. Prone to leave the flock. Prone to go astray, to go their own way. If you understand, a shepherd's staff has that curved hook on the end of it. It was for bringing sheep back when they'd start to wander off the path. They start to wander away. They could grab it right around the midsection and pull it back. Could restore that sheep very, very quickly. But there would be times when the sheep would wander far, far away. And the shepherd would have to leave the rest in another person's care, and he would chase after that one. There might be a time when, I'll illustrate this a little bit, where a sheep would be cast down. A sheep would fall on its back and it couldn't get up. It would sit there in worry and anxiety and fear, and the shepherd would have to go and raise it back on its feet again. Restoration. The New Testament talks often of restoring a saint who has gone the wrong way. It talks about church discipline. It talks about doing things in order not to cast another believer out, not to make them feel horrible, not to berate them and beat them over the head, but to bring them back into a point of fellowship with God. You may know some, or you may feel like this. When one who is astray, one who is gone, you just want to take them and shake them a little bit. You want to get in their face and set them straight. You want to tell them that this is how you need to live. Not what you're doing right now. But does the Good Shepherd treat them like that? Does God go and berate them? Or does God lovingly call them back to the fold? First thing we're going to look at today is restoration from the wrong direction. Sheep, as we talked about, are short-sighted, have bad eyesight, and are not very wise, which makes them prone to wander. We've talked about in weeks past how they see a nice little patch of grass and they think that's all that matters, and they go over there. Wandering from the fold, wandering from the protection of the shepherd. Or think of a sheep who maybe is in fear or in anxiety, in worry, has fled and run away, not worrying where anything else was, and soon gets lost. When we think of a sheep wandering, really if we jump to the worst case scenario for an animal, for a sheep, that when a sheep wanders far from the shepherd, in isolation it will eventually die. Like we said, sheep don't have much for self-defense other than to run. They're not the brightest, they're not the most gifted, and on their own, they will suffer and struggle. We as people are prone to wander, prone to leave the presence of God. We often do that which pleases our flesh more than we do that which pleases God. Romans 7:15 says, "For that which I do, I allow not. For that I would, that do I not. But what I hate, that do I. If then I do that which I would not, I consent unto the law that it is good. Now then it is no more I that do it, but sin that dwelleth in me. For I know that in me, that is in my flesh, dwelleth no good thing. For to will, for the desire to do right, is present within me. But how to perform that which is good, I find not. For the good that I would do, that I would, I do not. But the evil which I would not, that I do." Not only do we know those who we love, who we care about, that have gone astray, but we also are susceptible to going astray. There is no pastor, there is no minister, there is no Christian who has been in a relationship with God so long that they are not vulnerable to going the wrong direction. As we listen this morning, we might be quick to point the finger and say, "Oh, this person I know has gone astray," or that other person on the other side of the auditorium, they might be prone to going astray, but not me. I'm not really worried about it. My brother, my cousin, that church member, they could mess up. They could leave the presence of God. Oh, I've heard the things they've said. I've seen the things they've done, the things they've posted on Facebook, and they could be somebody who could go astray. But oh, not me. 1 Corinthians 10:12 says, "Let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall." This morning I say, beware that you don't fall into sin. And I say that to myself. In order to not have to get to the point where we need to be restored, we should desire to be as close to God as we can, being aware of any point in our heart, in our life, where we are desiring to go astray. And for those away from God, we should pray that they would see the goodness and the love of the Good Shepherd to bring them back to His fold. In a world today, in an American culture of Christianity, many say that it's okay for Christians to drink, at least maybe socially. It's fine for Christians to listen to some rock, some country, or some hip-hop music, maybe some of the oldies, some of the stuff that people used to listen to a long time ago. It's not as bad as what there is today. It's okay to watch some television or some movies that have, maybe just an inappropriate scene here or there. Maybe it has blasphemy in it. It's okay. Our culture says don't be so uptight. It's okay to do this or that. Just do what makes you happy. But most of those things will lead our hearts and minds astray from the Good Shepherd. And say all of those things and more would lead us away from the presence of God. This morning we're going to talk about restoration. There are multiple times in which a shepherd will need to restore a sheep. The first idea is when a sheep wanders away from the shepherd. When a sheep wanders away from the fold, as I said, the shepherd has that staff and he pulls them back and he pulls them back and he corrects them. He corrects them nicely and lovingly, and he keeps bringing the sheep back. But some stubborn sheep will leave and 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 will leave. And that might sound like some of us or somebody we know. They leave the presence of God, and God pulls them back and God pulls them back. But eventually that sheep, if it is stubborn enough, will leave the shepherd and get far enough away and will not desire to come back. And the shepherd will chase the sheep and will go after the sheep, and oftentimes it would do something surprising. The shepherd would take the staff and would break the sheep's leg. Throw the sheep around his shoulders and carry the sheep with him until the leg was healed. And at that point, the sheep had been carried by the shepherd, had to have been held up to be fed, had to be held up to drink from water, all by the good shepherd who loved and cared about the sheep. Even though we think it's not very loving to have to break the sheep's leg. But the shepherd would restore that sheep through that broken leg, hold the sheep close for as long as it needed to take for the sheep to heal. And when the sheep was ready to go back on his own, the shepherd would set the sheep down and let the sheep walk. And oftentimes that sheep would walk closer to the shepherd than any other sheep. The other instance in which the shepherd would need to restore the sheep is when it had been cast down. There are some instances in which a sheep would be cast down. Maybe in anxiety and worry, the sheep would be running or would be fleeing, or maybe just throwing up his hands in desperation and quitting. The sheep would fall on his side and roll on his back and have nowhere to put his legs to get back up. Or there would be other times in which the sheep would just want to be a little comfortable. Would look for a nice, soft part of land and would go to lay down and would lay on its side and get so comfortable that it would flip over on its back. And I said the sheep will not be able to get back up. If you've ever seen an animal or a bug on its back not able to get back up, it's a pretty pitiful sight. This might be mean of me, but I used to do it to some bugs. I would take them and flip them on their back and just watch them struggle, and I don't know why. It's probably just a guy thing. But I would look at it, and you think it's pitiful. You see the legs flailing. You see their desire to get back over, but they can't. Eventually, what would happen? Well, for a sheep, their legs would go numb, with the blood rushing and moving to parts of the body in a fashion that does not normally. Some parts on the inside would start to swell up. Some organs might start to fail. Eventually, the sheep would be anxious, would be worried, would terrify itself to death in a struggle to get back on its feet. That is what it means for a sheep to be cast down. If you think of the word picture, when David would say, "Why art thou cast down, O my soul?" It was almost as if David was saying, why am I on my back, struggling, worrying, anxious, and not able to get on my feet? There may be days when you feel like that. When maybe you wake up in the morning and you're worried, or you're discouraged, and you're anxious, and that day you really don't feel like doing much. In your soul there is discouragement and depression. And you need the Good Shepherd to pick you up. There may be a time when you feel comfortable. Oh, I don't need to worry about my devotions today. Oh, I prayed and got a message from church. I'm just fine on my own today. I don't need to worry. And as that sheep would get a little bit too comfortable on the grass, we would be tempted to get too comfortable in our lives, pushing away from the Good Shepherd, and then on our back before we realize it, unable to get back up on our feet. Now, what does the Good Shepherd do? The Good Shepherd picks up the fallen. As a sheep is falling, it has no way to get up on its own. It will fail, it will struggle, it might even cry out for help. But ultimately, it can't get back up. The sheep needs for the shepherd to pick it back up again. How often we are similar. We fall in discouragement, maybe in disobedience, maybe in failure, and we lay there not able and maybe even sometimes not even wanting to get back up. And we flail and we struggle and we cry out for help. We need the loving shepherd to pick us back up and restore our soul. Maybe there's a loved one you see, and they're struggling. Their desire is right. They want to get right with God. They want to do that which is right. They want to be in the place where they are closely following the shepherd, but find themselves unable to get back up. Not because of desire, but because they're trying in their own strength instead of living in the strength of God. Some of you may see that this week. And you can see the struggle, and you can see the inability. And you see and you so desire to help. So remember that the best thing you could do is to pray for them and point them to the hand of the Good Shepherd. So many today have been cast down. I think today many probably mostly from discouragement, from depression. Some from falling into sin. some from doing that which is right in their own eyes. And what they need is not to be berated, not for you to sit down at the Thanksgiving table, not for you to pick up the phone and tell them everything that's wrong with their life, but for you to remind them of the love of God. For you to remind them what they are missing in a relationship with the Good Shepherd. Yes, you must take a stand against sin. Yes, you should not condone their lifestyle. But what a sheep does not need is for you to go and yell at them and tell them what they're doing is wrong and that they need to get up. But to lovingly point them back to Jesus Christ. Not only is the sheep picked up, not only does the shepherd pick up the fallen sheep, but the shepherd comforts the broken. Not only does the shepherd pick up the sheep that has been cast down, but he picks them up and he nurtures them back to health. As I said, the sheep that is cast, often its legs begin to go numb, parts of his body will begin to come swollen. So what does the shepherd do? He takes them and he lays them on their side. And he rubs and massages the sheep where his legs are numb, maybe where parts of his body are swollen. Because if he were just to pick up the sheep and set it back on his feet, it would fall straight back down again, with no strength, with no feeling to get back up. So God nurtures them. They need the shepherd to come by and help. When someone or something breaks their leg, the first thing you do is not go grab it and set it straight. Yet so often, our first impulse when somebody wanders away from God is to go grab them and set them straight. To go grab them and tell them exactly what's wrong and to tell them exactly where they have failed. But God does not treat them that way. You think of the woman at the well. God did not come by and tell her exactly what she needed to do, right? That she was living in sin, and God did not sit there and berate her. But instead, God lovingly offered her the living water. I think of the woman caught in adultery. God did not sit there and cast the first stone. God did not sit there and berate her and argue with her and yell at her and put her down. But God lovingly took his arm and comforted her, took his words and his voice and protected her in love and in grace. Not in anger and in backlash. Why do we try to do with people that are gone astray the exact opposite of what God does? I've seen time and time again, one who is hurting with a loved one or a friend who has gone astray, the first thing they do is pick up the phone and yell at them and tell them everything that's wrong, instead of offering the grace and the love of God. I understand that there is a fine line between grace and truth. I understand that there is not to be only grace in which you only lift them up in love, telling them that, oh, it's just fine, the way you are living is okay. No, that is not what you are supposed to do. Yes, you are supposed to denounce sin, say that it is wrong. But in the loving attitude of the Good Shepherd, and not the angry attitude of another sheep, frustrated at a sheep who's laying on a piece of grass, frustrated at a sheep that can't get up, wanting him to move. Often we look at sin, we look at another sheep who's gone astray, and our first impulse is just to set them straight. What God does, what the Good Shepherd does, is he lays them down and dusts them off. He rubs the areas that don't work like they used to. He lovingly nurtures the sheep back to health, and then he restores the soul that has been astray. He gets them right spiritually. He deals with their heart, and he nurtures them lovingly, bringing them along in a pattern of growth, tenderly and patiently. Growth. Often it takes some growth to be fully restored back to new. sometimes we don't have the patience to allow a growth in another person's life. Growth is a process. For some, it is longer than it is for others. For some of us, growing up in school, it took you or it took your friend a little bit longer to understand algebra. Maybe a little bit longer to understand English. If you're like me, you never understood geometry. Some of you, it might take a little bit longer to grow in that area. They had a friend, it took them a little bit longer to understand how to play sports. Or maybe you've trained some people at your job. And some of them, it took just a little bit longer than you would have preferred for them to understand what they're supposed to do. At times that could be frustrating. Why? Because we just want them to get it right, so we don't have to deal with them anymore. But that is not what God does. God does not look at us trying to grow, striving to grow. God does not look at the soul that needs restoration, flailing its arms, trying to be restored, with the desire to be right with God, and become angry with them because it is taking them a little bit longer to grow. No, He does not excuse their failures and their wrongdoings, but He nurtures them back in a pattern of growth. The Good Shepherd picks up the fallen. The Good Shepherd comforts the broken. Then the Good Shepherd puts the healed back in the right way. As that cast sheep has been laid on its side and nurtured back and picked back up, He then leads them to the right way. He sets them back on their feet, back in His own presence, and leads them in the path in which they should go. One who has been astray and has been cast down is now free to follow the shepherd in the right way. And as I said earlier, often they then follow closer than they had before. No sin is too big for God to forgive. No failure is too terrible for somebody to not be restored. The Good Shepherd's desire is love and restoration in a manner which is nurturing, which is gracious, and which is merciful. It is not an attitude of bitterness and anger, but is an attitude in bringing somebody back to the fold. And there are times in which there is sternness and firmness required. But overall, God's grace, love, and mercy is shown with no excuse for sin. When seeing somebody be restored, it is not a time to excuse their wrongdoing, but it is a time for them to rightly confess and get right with God. And thank God for the promise of 1 John 1:9, that if we confess our sins, He is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. The sheep who has gone astray, who needs restoration, will have to face their decisions before God. They will have to get right, yes. But the first thing you do with somebody who's broken is not set them straight. But they're to be nurtured, they're to be picked up, they're to be forgiven and put in the right way. When the Good Shepherd forgives and restores the fallen sheep, He forgives completely. And the sheep are given a new chance at walking close to the shepherd. For some of us, that might not sound good. I think of Jonah. He went to Nineveh and he saw them become revived. He saw a whole nation, a whole town turn back to God. And he became angry. He became bitter with God. And I find it amazing what he told God. He said that he had ran away because he knew that God was tender and gracious and merciful and would repent him of the evil. That's why he didn't want to go to Nineveh. Understandably, that's why he was angry. That is not the attitude of God. That is not the attitude of a good shepherd seeking to restore his own. God's attitude to a lost sheep is love, grace, and mercy. Yes, firmness against sin. Yes, there is no excuse for a sheep who has done wrong. But it is not for us to look at them and put them down. It is not for us to argue with them over the dinner table this coming Thursday. It's not for us to look at them in disgust and in bitterness. It's not for us to look at them in anger. But it's for you to put your arm around them and point them to the Good Shepherd who can restore their soul. Maybe it's you in discouragement this morning that needs to be restored. It's not for somebody to come by and say, "What's wrong with you? What's wrong with your attitude?" That doesn't really do anything, does it? When things aren't going your way, it's not for somebody else to come over and tell you it's all that what you've done. You think of Job, when he lost everything, and his friends came by and told him, and he pointed the finger in Job's face and told him how it was because he had sinned. Calling out Job for the failures that really weren't there. Not knowing that it was because God had recommended Job for his justness and his perfection and put Job through a test. So when you deal with somebody who's restored, when it's yourself who's going through discouragement, don't handle the situation in anger, in a bad spirit, wanting to just set them straight. But pray for them. Treat them as the Good Shepherd, tenderly and graciously and mercifully. Second part of that verse says, "He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake." Not only are sheep restored, but they're set on a right direction. Sheep going in their own way often wear down a path over and over and over and over again, possibly in a path that the shepherd has led them on. And they travel it down and they travel it down until really in that path there is nothing left. The sheep may stay in the same pasture and overgraze in which there is no grass left for them. Going in a direction, going down a path that is barren, and they will eventually suffer. So what does the Good Shepherd do? The shepherd takes the sheep and sets them on new paths. Takes them to a green pasture. Takes them to a place where they can feed and eat as normal. Shepherd or sheep who have been restored are free to follow. Those of us who have, or those sheep who have been faithful, those of you who have been faithful, God leads you on the same path. God gives the sheep a right direction. When a sheep who has gone astray, God restores them and sets them on the right direction. But God leads all of his sheep in the paths of righteousness. Our shepherd does not lead us to walk aimlessly. Our shepherd does not lead us to live right in our own eyes. In my own time with the Lord, I'm going through the book of Judges, and that is often the phrase, "and they did right in their own eyes." If the sheep are left to do what is right in their own eyes, they will overgraze on a pasture until it's completely useless. They will go to a place in which they see something far away and get themselves into trouble. And that is why the shepherd leads us. He shows us the way to live, the way to walk, and he constantly shows us the next step, and the next path. God's desire for us is not that we get into a rut of formality and mindless obedience, but that we are constantly making choices to live in the path of righteousness. And that is why his word is so rich and so full of truth. We can plod down one path, seeking out righteousness multiple times, and then go on to the next God-directed path. Why? Because the shepherd is faithful. In order for the shepherd to restore and lead sheep in righteousness, he is constantly faithful to the sheep, looking out 100% of the time to ensure that the sheep have a good pasture, to ensure that every sheep is following close to the shepherd, to make sure that each and every sheep is well taken care of. For a shepherd to notice that a sheep is cast down, he must be constantly with his sheep, taking notice and taking care and taking count. For a shepherd to notice when a sheep constantly wants to go his own direction, he's constantly caring because he is faithful. The shepherd leads us on paths. It's not just one straight path of do this, do that, do this, do that. That is what the Pharisees were into. Obey this rule, obey that law, obey this rule, obey this, obey this, obey this, obey this. But rather, God's path for us is a path that will wind and curve and maybe sometimes lead us to a split. The path may change direction suddenly or even seemingly be unclear, but it is a path that the shepherd has led us on, and our job is to follow it. Even when it doesn't make sense, to do that which God has told us. To obey the word, the path of righteousness that God has given us. 5 years ago, you may have been in a different city, a different job, a different church. And now being in an entirely different city, different job, a different church, and still being the exact will of God that God has for your life. Because God's will and God's desire for you to follow Him in paths of righteousness is not one basic decision for your life, but rather it is a daily decision to follow God one step at a time. The path in which God leads us on is one of faith, obedience, and trust. And these are paths of righteousness. If you're contemplating a life decision, a decision for which to take yourself or your family, notice that God's paths for your life will never lead opposite to the Word of God. Will never lead contrary to the character and the person of God, but will always lead you into righteousness. When we see a soul that's gone astray, it's because they thought they were making the right decision, but ultimately it was a decision that did not line up with the righteousness of God. See that these are paths of righteousness. Lead us in paths of righteousness for His name's sake. Why does the shepherd restore? Why does the shepherd lead us? Why does the shepherd guide us each and every step of the way? Why is the shepherd so good and so kind? For His name's sake. Everything that is done is for the glory and honor of God. The shepherd has no greater joy in life than to be assured that he has all of his sheep in the fold and that they are all healthy and taken care of. The desire for the good shepherd is our well-being. The desire for the shepherd is that we would walk close to Him in paths of righteousness. Read that verse again. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for His name's sake. I don't know where each of you are this morning. Some of you may feel cast down in your soul and in your spirit. And today, just look to the Good Shepherd for His love, His compassion, and His care. Some of you may have a loved one, a family member, somebody you care about that you know needs to be restored. The object is not to go to them and be a jerk and be mean and tell them every single thing that's wrong, but to lovingly guide them to the Good Shepherd who can restore them. And the desire is for all of us to walk in paths of righteousness, not to go astray as the sheep that needs to be restored, but to follow God's will for our lives one step at a time, understanding that God's will, God's path will never lead us contrary to righteousness or to His will, but but to stick close to the shepherd. When God's will seems unclear, remember that His is His word that will be a light into our path, a lamp unto our feet. Remember that it's His still small voice that will lead us and guide us. Maybe this morning something seems unclear because you're not as close to the shepherd as you should be, following Him down the path in which you ought to go. God is the good shepherd. God is a shepherd who restores. If you're here this morning and you need to be restored, He'll do it lovingly and tenderly, not excusing your failures, but lovingly guiding you back to a path of righteousness.